Give a clap and...
All right.
Okay.
Hello.
Hi.
You know who I am.
I do.
I know who you are.
Yes.
All right. Thank you very much for coming to talkPOPc.
My
This
pleasure.
is great. I'm super excited. Let me turn around. Let's focus. All right.
It's going to be good.
This is going to be good. All right. So, you know, I don't know how much you know about this. You've probably heard a little bit about the project I've been doing for a while, but so I'll kind of give you a quick summary. So,
Yeah, please.
I started this about 10 years ago, actually a long time ago now, right? And I did an exhibition down in Philadelphia, right? And it was on nominalism, because I was working on that topic at the time. And I just published that book on Nelson Goodwin, right, on nominalism, right? And so I had a bunch of drawings and video and stuff like that, and I thought, you know, it's going to be a little hard for people to really understand nominalism, right, going through the gallery. So I thought, I'm going to get a separate room, right, that just has a bunch of philosophers in it. And then the people who go through the gallery, then they can go into this other room and just talk to philosophers. So Noel Carroll came and a bunch of people from UPenn, right? And I was like, oh my God, this is so cool, right? I mean, conversation is the fun part.
Yeah.
So I kind of thought, all right, I'm just going to incorporate conversation into my art practice.
Great.
So the original urge was that, right?
Nice.
And then we've kind of like held conversations and sort of done it from topic to topic that I'm working on. So each topic, right, I make a bunch of artwork about it, and then I write a book about it. So this is our third project. The first one was nominalism, and then it was censorship, right? And now this one is artist cognition.
Very
so
cool.
then I mean, it's kind of a complicated process. It's a really crazy project, but you know, like I kind of feel like what we do as philosophers is really more conversation than what we ever admit. You know, we want to think it's these soliloquies that we give, right? But in fact, it's all the information that was put into our head by other people, right? That then we kind of sift through and then spit out, right? And so, and I think art is very much the same thing. So it's this constant recycling that we do of each other's thoughts, right? So so this project is that. So, you know, I take quotes from people and they get worked back into the artwork in slips of paper, right? You know, so the whole thing is in some ways sort of like almost a scientific experiment about how we come to consensus about things. So
That's lovely. No, I love that. I mean, the analogy between philosophy and art, and then the combination of the two is its own sort of entity, and it's kind of both philosophy and art at the same time in between.
Yeah,
I think
so
it's great. No, that project sounds amazing.
Thank you. That's great. So anyway, then we sort of go around and ask people, so do you think art is cognition? Or if not, what do you think it is? And so I ask you what we ask everybody on the street.
Yeah. Okay. So I feel like there's a few ways to sort of approach. I mean, the philosopher in me wants to do two things, right? It wants to ask what is art, and then it wants to ask what is cognition, and then we kind of see if there's like this overlay between the two, right?
A little Venn diagram moment.
Sure, right. We give the necessary sufficient conditions, sufficient conditions, and then we kind of read it off like a little list. Practice, I don't think it's that easy. But I do think art as cognition. I mean, I guess I just have a question to set the sort of groundwork. I mean, do you think, what do you take cognition to be? Is it this sort of conscious activity? Is it an intellectual activity? Could it be an embodied activity? So I guess what kind of framework do you think you would be, like, I mean, in answering the question for yourself, do you think art is?
Yeah, well, I don't think cognition is all conscious.
Very good.
I think that a lot of the cognitive processes that we go through are not conscious, which is, I think, what makes us interesting.
Absolutely.
Right? And I think a lot of it is embodied. I don't think that we have a really, this is one of the big divides between analytic and continental, right? You know, like continental are always going on and on about how we analytic philosophers do not understand embodied experience.
Absolutely.
And it is a good criticism, right? So I don't know really how to build the framework for this, which is kind of why I'm going around asking people, so how the hell do we do this?
So, funny enough, I'm currently working on my dissertation, and a part of it's on free will and meaning in life, but one of the chapters I'm looking to construct is about art, but more specifically, I'm interested in cases of dance. And I think dance is a really interesting art form in that the artist and the art object are kind of one and the same. So like oftentimes, right, there's this distinction between product and process, where the product of an artistic activity is a painting or a sculpture. And then, you know, you can sort of distinguish between here's the work that the artist produced, and then the sort of activity they went through, you know, trying out different materials, maybe different colors on a canvas and so forth. But with dance, it's like the the observers, the audience members, they're kind of observing one in the same moment, the artistic activity and the art object, right? The choreography was both, the thing that motivated the dancer to try to convey certain emotions or themes or ideas. And so I'm really interested in this, the example of dance, and this is sort of why I asked about what you think cognition is, because I think there's a really interesting relationship between dance, between embodied sort of experiences and free will. And so I'm sort of operating with a position called agency incompatibilism. It was coined by Helen Stewart, and well, her sort of libertarian framework, right, metaphysical libertarian framework of free will differs from the traditional kind in that she thinks human beings have freedom of the will, and even animals, in terms of fine-grained bodily settlement. So she thinks our powers of freedom are found in, how we go about making a cup of coffee, right? How many times do I stir the spoon, right? At what angle do I tilt the spoon when I put the sugar in? All these little fine-grained aspects of our body. And so I think there's a really nice overlap between dance, between freedom in this very, particular sense, and then of course meaning in life. But I guess to answer your question, I don't think I think there are definitely aspects or kinds of art which are cognitive, but in this sort of very embodied, unconscious, unreflective way.
Yeah. Let me say two things. That was very interesting, whole discussion right there. And I don't know if you know this about me, Alex, but I'm super, super, super bad at names. So I don't remember the name of this person whose paper I included in an edited volume I did a couple of years ago with Rutledge. But I did an edited volume on perception, cognition, and aesthetics. And a man, whoever he was, did a paper that was absolutely wonderful about how you know when you've begun to dance. So sort of examining the slow motion distinctions between just moving, right, doing sugar, right, putting the sugar in the coffee, right, and then dancing, right, and it really changed the way I thought about everything, because I started to see all sorts of actions walking down the street, right, and how we all walk so differently, right, we all walk entirely differently, and how wonderful it would be to learn how to walk like other people.
Yeah.
I've become fascinated with this idea, right, because you would have to embody them in some way, their whole attitude about the world.
Oh, absolutely.
Right, in order to walk like them.
Yeah.
So I think that's a right kind of way of looking at it, like those tiny little decisions that we make, almost like low level.
Yeah, no, that's precisely
really
it.
Low level.
Yeah, and I think the question becomes even more interesting, because I guess, like dance, and if we're keeping with this analogy, like just walking down the street, oftentimes, like in the dance room, choreographers they'll start to sort of improvise, but then they'll be like consciously aware of something they did, and there's that really nice interweaving between conscious attention to particular bodily movements and unconscious bodily movements, right?
Yeah.
If they're really focused on how they're manipulating their wrist or their neck, it seems like they might not be too focused on how their feet are positioned.
That's true.
And yet at the same time they'll sort of position their feet in a certain way while doing the other movement. And I think similarly, when we're walking down the street, I've often become cognizant of the fact, it's so funny when I walk next to my partner or my brother, walking down with my friends, I'll notice sometimes we're walking on the same foot, right? Just sort of we're in conversation and then we're kind of in sync in that way, right? And then, or if they're swaying their shoulders a little more because of the nature of the conversation, all these sort of inclinations and temperaments and even mood, it sort of all goes into these bodily level actions, I guess you would call them actions.
Yeah, all right, so let's go down this road.
Yeah.
Now, so we've got a road here where part of what we do is conscious and part of what we do is not conscious, right? And the artworks are made in that terrain, right?
I would think so.
Is that what we're...
They're made in that terrain. I think so. I think...
So when you're talking about the dancer,
Sure.
I think you're probably right. Part of it is articulated and conscious decisions, right? But a lot of them are almost the habits of the practice, or something that gets incorporated accidentally but becomes part of the whole.
I think so. Unfortunately, it's so interesting, these questions about art, and I know you're an artist, so I feel like oftentimes when we talk about art, and I'm interested in aesthetics and courses in aesthetics, but a lot of the time when philosophers answer these questions about art, it's like, we should just ask the artists. See what they, they should have the say over the practice, right, the activity. And so a lot of the times I want to say, I think it's a combination of kind of the interweaving between conscious reflection and unconscious movement in the case of dance. But other times I feel like some artists might proclaim like, no, it was all conscious activity, right? I'm the the sort of arbiter of the sculpture or the painting, and to think that I was unconscious during the creation might sort of take away from my artistic achievement, right? I mean, and this is where it sort of becomes analogous to free will and losing control over one's actions. Like, how could we truly praise or commend someone for producing this brilliant dance if all of it was just unconscious and accidental, maybe?
But think about this, right? Like, I just do visual art, right? The way that somebody holds a brush, right? The way that somebody holds the brush is like you were talking about with dancers. Like, part of it is very conscious, but a lot of it is just the habits that you formed over your lifetime about the way you pick something up and hold it, right? Do you do it roughly? Do you do it delicately? All of that's the signatures that artists have. We're so much about these just, we say instinctual, maybe that's not the right word.
Habitual?
Right? Habitual is a better
maybe,
word.
Right.
Habitual kind of, right. Habitual, I think that's, right. William James wrote that wonderful chapter on habit, right? Yeah.
Immediately to
yeah,
think
right. I know, me too. Right. These habitual ways that we have of touching the world, right? And it's like walking in that way. That's the way I do it, right? And you could perhaps consciously manipulate some aspects of it, but there's going to be a lot that's just, I hate to say beyond your control, but almost beyond your control.
I'm on board with it. I mean, I totally agree, and I think it speaks to the sort of uniqueness of the artist, right? I mean, no one sort of brought to the canvas what you could ever bring, because you have a whole history behind you that's sort of not identical to anybody and could never be, right? So I think in that sense, I mean, I'm not too familiar with the fine arts like painting and sculpting, but I'm sure that follows through to the canvas, right? I mean, your history and your mood and your temperament and your desires and your habits, they kind of just translate onto the canvas.
And you can tweak around the edges, right? And you can make some changes, but you can't just become a different person who walks down the street differently.
Yeah.
You just can't do that. That's not you,
and
right?
The attempt to, I think, change that is something that's a part of your history, right? That sort of in itself refines the kind of quote-unquote walking that you're doing, right? I'm going to walk differently, and so that sort of reflection speaks to how you're now going to walk, right?
Yeah. So this is a weird analogy that we've got going here, relating art making to walking, right? but if walking is related to dancing, then why not?
That's what we're running with.
Yeah, that's what we're running with, right?
Walking.
Yeah. Right, very funny. So maybe that's the way that we get some understanding of the relationship between conscious activity and unconscious embodied activity, right? And how the two kind of marry each other. And I think in a very peculiar way in art.
I agree.
Right?
Totally.
So that's the part that I can't quite...
I see.
Yeah, you see?
Okay. So the question is sort of hinging on, like, is art cognition, and then if we're sort of running with this unconscious-conscious sort of parallel, where exactly is that question placed, right?
Yeah, but maybe, Alex, more than that, maybe it's that, all right, I'm going to just say it, I think art is probably the paradigm of cognitive activities. And I think it's the paradigm of cognitive activities because it has a very peculiar way of combining conscious awareness and conscious decision-making with unconscious decision-making. And I do want to say decision-making even though it's unconscious.
Right.
Or non-conscious, however, whatever word you want to use, right? I don't consciously decide how to walk down the street, right? And yet I'm deciding to put one foot, and putting one foot in front of the other.
And so I guess I'm just a little curious on the paradigm claim for all cognitive activity. And so do you think?
Maybe saying too much.
No. I think intuitively I want to agree. It feels right. I mean, I don't know if it sounds right, but it definitely feels right. And so for all cognitive activity, scientific activity, mathematical activity, decision making, there's something. So is the claim that there's something about art or artistic activity that follows us into those practices? Is that the claim, or there's something about like what art is that sort of is there in every practice?
Okay, all right. Kind of neither, right? And the fault is mine, right?
No.
I think that in things like scientific activity or mathematics or things like that, I think that that's probably, I don't know what the percentage would be, but like 90% conscious. Like,
Yeah.
you know, you're focused on every single decision, right? And you're not supposed to be going by habit, right? And that sort of embodied way, right? But I think that what art is the paradigm of is how is being alive. So when not when we're doing something very specific like science or math or something like that, right? But when we're just reacting to each other, when we're going and accomplishing something silly like going shopping or something like that, it is, I think, about the same kind of mixing of conscious and non-conscious activities is what happens in art.
I see.
That's kind of why I think I think that both viewing art and making art is paradigm of cognition in the very basic functions of cognitions for humans, not in these specialist kinds of functions.
I see. Yeah.
Right, which I think are probably different.
Yeah.
Right, and they're not as embodied.
Right.
Right. Art is embodied in the way that we are embodied as people in normal everyday life.
Yeah.
Right? And I think art has that way of producing cognitive reactions in people in the same way that we have cognitive reactions to each other as a normal everyday part of life.
Yeah, and this conversation is just, it's reminding me of, I think it might not be Twilight of the Idols, but the Nietzsche distinction between the rational man or the scientific man and the artist, right? And the artist sort of, you know, he makes this distinction that the scientist, you know, builds this framework, right, this sort of glass cannon, so to speak.
Yeah.
And so all of these concepts would fit together, whereas the artistic man sort of just, it's pure will almost in a sense, right? The artist
It's knocked down, Dionysus gets knocked down, stands up, knocked down, stands up.
It's that sort of impressing one's will on the world.
Yeah.
And in that sense, our everyday activities are just
impressing our will on the world,
right? Because that's just what it is, right? That's just what artistic activity is.
Yeah, and you know, he's very, you know, Nietzsche's very overdramatic, and very sort of adolescent about it all. But you know, the scientific man is like booed down,
right?
You know, is trying to control things he can't control, blah blah blah, right? So it's the Apollo that he doesn't like.
There you go, right?
Yeah. But right, you're right, right? That I guess what I'm saying is parallel to what Nietzsche was saying, right?
Yeah.
What is that essay? Lies in non-moral sense.
Yeah. I think
it's something like that, right?
Yeah.
He talks about
in
it there.
a non-moral sense, right?
Yeah.
I think that's what it is.
Yeah. Yeah, you're right. So I guess is what I'm saying is that the sort of the cognitive paradigm, right, of art is us,
right?
Is what we do, in everyday life, and I think it's a way of us understanding the world in an embodied way.
And I really like that assessment. And I guess I have a question. I'm interested in the relationship between the self and our sort of artistic practices. Do you think there needs to be some sort of identification of the agent with this sort of artistic product or activity? So if we're taking this line and saying that we're sort of, you know, the cognitive paradigm is just within us, it's this sort of unconscious, conscious duality, we go about our everyday lives, right? There seems to be that this is what art is. But do you think there needs to be, do you think the individual needs to say, yeah, this is a reflection of me?
Yeah,
or
that's an identity thing, right?
Yeah.
But I think that most artists think that their practice defines them and is an articulation of their inner self. I mean, I think that most artists think that what they're doing with their art is taking a first-person phenomenological awareness of the world and making it into a third-person object that's then accessible to other people, so other people can more or less experience the world in the same way that they experience the world. I think it's that kind of like mirror neurons, right, sort of thing, you know, in that transition from the first person to the third person. I think that, and so in that way, I think that artists feel that they are giving at least fundamental nub of themselves, right?
Yeah.
Whether or not it's what everybody else thinks of them is probably not correct.
Yeah.
Right? A lot of people look at the artist and the art and they go, I don't see any connection at all.
Right.
You know?
Right.
But I don't think that artists usually feel that way.
Okay, that's super interesting. Yeah, I mean, I'm always interested in this question of like, could the artist be wrong about their work? Right? I mean, I guess in the sense of we're talking about maybe not praise and like failing to meet some criteria for a standard, right? Like writing a tragedy.
That's not who I am.
Yeah, but merely just being like, oh, I hated this piece. This is a reflection of who I am. And yet someone comes along and says, well, look at all your other work you've done. I mean, it's almost parallel in this, that, and this way. And yet the artist wants to refuse that, wants to refuse those standards.
Yeah, but to refuse one piece would not be the same thing as to refuse the whole canon.
Sure.
Right? You'd have to refuse the whole canon to say that that's not me.
Yeah.
And that's almost hard to even parse what that would mean.
Right.
Yeah, someone produced a whole body of work that didn't at all. I mean, you could sort of imagine.
Yeah, and this is, I guess, what I'm.
Right.
Some really
imagine for somebody. Maybe they thought it was going to make a lot of money, and they just figured out a way to make a lot of money. And I think that has happened, right?
Okay. Oh, that's a great example.
Right. So in those cases, that doesn't at all reflect them. They're just kind of like marketing, right?
Right.
To
survive as
whatever,
a striving artist. Yeah,
so I think that can happen. But normally I think that there's a kind of expression, right?
Yeah.
Isn't that the word that's often used, right? Art is a kind of expression, right? What's it Volheim said? Pressing out.
Yeah.
I always like that, right? It's a pressing out.
Art in its objects?
Yeah, I think so, yeah, right?
Yeah.
So
very interesting.
all right, so let's kind of reel backwards, right? So, where do we think we've come here? What do we think? It's been a funny roundabout. Let me try to recap it for us. All right. So when I sort of first started asking you, right? You interestingly enough kind of wanted to go into dance first, right? Right. And to you that was interesting because there was almost a transparency between the maker and the thing made.
Yes.
Right? They merged and became right in the body of the artist. Right?
Precisely.
And so that was interesting. But I'm not sure if I really got to why that was interesting for you. But I suspect now that we're at the end, I understand why.
Yeah.
Because you were interested in whether or not art reflects the identity of the person. So with dance, it would be hard for it not to reflect the identity of the person, since it is the person
itself. And I feel like I'm being psychoanalyzed here. I mean, if I'm showing my hand, I also use the dance, and I thought I was going to be an actor and a dancer and a ballet and ballroom, and so that's sort of following me into my philosophical pursuits. But I think you hit the nail on the head. I am interested in, if we're connecting the two. I mean, the dance or the art object, and the sort of expressivity of the individual, right? I mean, could you ever separate the two in the case of dance, right?
Right, and so you seem to have a case here, right, in dance of arguing for the marriage between the two necessarily. Necessarily, right? Whereas
I think that's at stake, right? That's what's at stake.
Yeah, I think so too, right? But in the others, it's not necessary.
Yeah.
In the others, it's not necessary. We can sort of see the separation, but maybe the potential separation between the artist and the expression of the self, right? It doesn't matter that there are those cases where it can be separated, because in 90% of the cases, right, somebody's doing what they think is the right thing to do, right? So I do think in those cases we can say that there is this paradigmatic relationship between the first person experience and the third person object, right? That one just translates into the other. Right?
Yeah.
And so then what the audience gets is some version of the first person experience.
Yeah.
Right?
That's super interesting. And I think, and there's this sort of translation issue, and I'm not too familiar with, it might have been Wordsworth, this sort of, there's the purpose of art, is it Wordsworth? The function of art is to sort of express this sort of interiority, right? There's sort of emotions that the artist goes through, and they write poetry or they do art to sort of express that.
Right.
But that translation is again really interesting. I really like this distinction, or this, I guess, distinction between the first person sort of reflection or apprehension of one's art and the third person perspective of viewing one's art. I mean, there seems you hope that it's complete, that it's isomorphic, that the audience can really get what you are putting out.
Of course, that's success.
Right. I suppose that is.
Yeah. But let me go back to the Wordsworth thing and the emotion. See, this is kind of part of my interest here, is that I think that that's, and the same thing with Volheim and the expression thing, right? I think that this emphasis on emotion is wrong. Because I think that we know enough about how the brain works now to know that what emotion is just part of a much larger system, right? And you can't really separate out emotion from everything else that's going on, and judgment, right? And it was William James that said this in the 19th century. He was so right. He was so right, you know. So I think that I think that cognition has to somehow have a merging of the two, of judgment on something and one's emotional reaction to it. I don't think that you can really separate out your emotional reaction to something and pass that over without passing over all kinds of embedded schema that you're putting that emotional reaction in, right? You know, language itself, right, doesn't come neutral, right? Words are embedded in whole schemas, right, as our emotional reactions. So, you know, I think that it's really important to think of art as a kind of cognitive process and not an emotional expressive process. That's, you know, but how we construct a cognitive process then, and how we relate art to cognitive process then becomes quite difficult. Because now you've got to talk about cognition, which is what you started at the beginning, like, well, how are you really defining cognition, right? And so I guess what I want to be able to do, right, is to say that the practice of making art, and probably the practice of experiencing art too, but definitely the practice of making art is like the everyday cognition that we do all the time.
And I think that route you took through James, I think you put it perfectly, right? We have a system which can't necessarily be separated. One's judgments about something can't necessarily, because it's contained within the same system, neurological system, be separated from one's temperament or mood or emotion, right? Things you get in this sort of expressivist interpretation of art and so forth. And so in not being able to separate that, right, we carry that most literally everywhere with everything we do. And so if that's sort of the paradigm of art, which is cognition, right, because it falls under the same sort of physicalist system, then it's also going to be paradigm of our everyday activity, right? We bring with us our judgments, our moods, our
right, and they're
everything.
just inextricably married. Those things are inextricably, as they are in art also, right? And I think it's only in these sort of false disciplines and moments that we think that we can separate out the two, and that cognitively that we're separating out the two. But I don't really think that we ever do. I think James is really right. And I remember he says, you know, you bring certain emotions to the judgment, you know, certain sort of prejudices, and you can kind of control those, right? You know, but not entirely, right? You're always going to have some, and then you're going to have that judgment, and then you're going to have emotions that come after the judgment. And all of it, I kind of think of it as a sandwich. You know, you've got the bread and the meat in the middle, but it's one sandwich, you know?
Like, they feel like two different parts, they taste like two different parts, but they're part of the same whole.
It's one sandwich. Right? And I think that's the way cognition works.
That sounds right. And I think just relating this conversation back to it, the question about expressing oneself, I think, you know, that marriage between the unconscious and the conscious, I mean, one could argue, you know, one's practice of art in the unconscious is equally as authentic as one in the conscious.
Maybe more so.
Maybe
more so, right? As our interactions with each other, right? That's the same thing. Like, you know, what you can read by my reactions, right? The ones that are not deliberate are probably more meaningful to you, right? Knowing that they're not deliberate on my part. Like when you're talking about the dancer, you know, they might be holding their neck in a certain way, but their foot is going however it was going to go, right? And sometimes you sort of care more about the foot and wherever it was going to go than you do about the sort of artificial mannerist way that they did their neck, right?
What's that, right? You ask, like, oh, that was a really interesting, you know, you're viewing an actor as a director, and you say, what did you just do there? And maybe the way they shrugged their shoulders or gave a glare, it's like, I didn't even realize I did something. That was perfect.
That was it, right? Because it was authentic.
Authentic.
And
you
that's
didn't
kind
have
of what
this
we call
sort of monitoring.
Right. And so that's kind of, so I don't know how you structure a model, right, where you get the unconscious, non-conscious functioning with the conscious, you know, and how you get a model of cognition and a model of art making and a model of art viewing that takes in both of those two, and I think that's right. I think it's the two things, right? The conscious and the non-conscious, right? Sort of like, you know, we see things that we foveate on, and then we see things peripherally, right? But when we say we see, we're doing them both at the same time, right? And that's really important because we're only conscious of that stuff that we're foveating on. That stuff that's peripheral, we're not conscious of, and yet that comes into the perceptual field, you know? And so that's how we experience the world. And it's like, inextricable mix between the conscious and the non-conscious.
Yeah. It's overwhelming when you think about it. It's a little overwhelming.
No wonder we can't do this.
Right. And I wonder why maybe art's also a little overwhelming, I guess, too.
But I think we make art